Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Good morning. Welcome to the TTEITI's first webinar event for 2021. My name is Kerry Peters, and I am on the communications team here at the TTEITI. My job this morning is fairly simple, starting with some house announcements. First, distractions. Now is the time to grab yourself a cup of coffee or some water and check on your kids to make sure they're plugged into their online classes and make sure the dog is fed. But just to keep the barking to a minimum, we'll be muting your mics during the presentation until we get to the question and answer segment. Which reminds me, you will have an opportunity to ask questions and otherwise participate in this morning's session. And much of that will happen via the Q&A and the poll features, which you will find in the bottom menu on your Zoom window. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Mr. Sherwin Long, who is the head of the TTEITI, to make some brief remarks.
Thank you very much, Kerry, for your warm welcome. It's a pleasure for us to host this event in collaboration with the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute and the U.S. Embassy. For those of you that don't know, the TTEITI stands for the Trinidad and Tobago Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We are part of a global movement with 55 other countries that focuses on accountable management of the oil, gas, and mining resources. When anyone asks what we do at the TTEITI, we highlight that our work focuses on verifying the revenue the country earns from its oil, gas, and mining resources. But more importantly, we also focus on fixing systems to ensure that there's an improvement in revenue collection, data management, and audits and assurance. Our work is really a governance health check. But there's a misconception that, we only focus on revenue transparency. I think importantly, we pay attention to how revenue makes its way through government and how revenue benefits the public. We equip the public with this data, again, to help citizens ask the right questions of government and extractive companies to ensure their oil, gas, and mineral resources are being developed as efficiently as possible. And for us to know how the revenues benefit us all, it is important to be familiar with the technical data found in our budget. And this is why we're here today, to take a closer look at the data available and arm you with knowledge. This session is meant to really empower you, add to your knowledge bank to help effect the required changes. Again, we're excited to start this conversation, and we want this session to be really interactive. Again, as we welcome you all to this, our first webinar for 2021, we are pleased to have Ms. Malini Maharaj to share her special insight on open budget issues with us. She has worked extensively with the International Budget Partnership and has a very unique perspective. Ms. Maharaj is currently an assistant lecturer in the Department of Economics at UWI, where she has taught for the past 16 years. She has also lectured at SBCS as well as COSTAT. Apart from teaching, Ms. Maharaj has also been involved in research on projects involving governance, poverty, and the environment, while consulting with local and foreign institutions such as the EMA, the IDB, the World Bank, and the United Nations. Her area of specialization is sustainable development. She is a National Scholarship Awardee and a graduate of St. Joseph Convent, San Fernando, and Robert Village Hindu School in Tableland. She's currently completing her doctorate in economics. I think she's well placed to guide us on this important topic, and I would now like to pass over to you, Ms. Maharaj.
Thank you for that introduction, Sherwin, and thank you to the TTEITI for having me facilitate this webinar session today. It's certainly a pleasure to participate and to engage our civil society organizations on a very important topic as it relates to the quality of lives of all of our people, and especially of our generations to come. Now, today's webinar, as Sherwin indicated, is intended to be as interactive as possible. We are hoping that we can engage our participants in becoming more aware of the roles that they play in influencing the decision making within our country. And it's related to a lot of the developmental issues that we're grappling with right now. Now, my role here is to really draw upon my experience with the Open Budget Index through the Open Budget Partnership. So I've been working with the Open Budget Partnership for some 10 years through a process of observing the type of information that has been made available as part of our national budget process and the availability of documents that indicate the decisions and that support the decisions of our government in terms of how our resources are utilized and how they are allocated according to developmental priorities. Why is this important? Well, according to the international budget process, all people in a country should have access to relevant information on how public resources are raised and spent. They should be able to have opportunities to contribute to policy decisions that affect their livelihoods and futures, and assurance of robust budget oversight by independent, well-informed legislators and audit institutions. What we are all concerned about in some form or the other is our development, whether at a personal level, community level, and/or national level. We want better lives. We want to have that ability to manage and influence that. We lobby for better governance. We lobby for better understanding and knowledge on how we can inform budget decisions, how we can hold those that we entrust responsible and ensure that there are proper checks and balances would allow us to manage and influence the quality of lives that we live. According to the IBP further, government decisions on how public money is allocated and spent are moral choices. It reflects a nation's values and priorities. A nation's budget determines what services are available and to whom. So we're talking about things like schools for our children, medicine for the sick, and support for the unemployed. Especially now, there is a call for open budgets with COVID-19. The IMF actually said, do what it takes, but keep the receipts. And the question is therefore, have we ever been able to ask for the receipts? Do we know where to look? And do we know what to look for? Even before the pandemic, mass demonstrations in Haiti, Ecuador, France, and Iraq highlighted that despite country-specific tensions, the anger citizens felt in each country reflects a broad concern with inequality, exclusion, and lack of trust in the government, especially regarding the management and equitable distribution of public resources through government budgets. The lesson from this is that open budgets are becoming more and more important as populations become more aware that unaccountable systems must change. So in this webinar, we're hoping to put you on a path where you will be better equipped as civil society organizations and as a general public to find and understand budget information that allows you to determine how you can leverage budget data for activities such as research, advocacy, and fundraising. What budget allocations tell you about government's priorities and the mistakes CSOs need to avoid making when reviewing the budget statement? how you can benefit from deeper engagement with the national budget and practical advice for gaining more influence in the budget process, how revenues and expenditures really work, and how to read the budget as a CSO, and finally, what the budget timeline and budget process reveal about the ideal opportunity for CSOs. So while we focus on CSO engagement, we would like to highlight that budget participation takes into consideration all stakeholders. The term stakeholder refers to anyone affected by or has a stake in government decisions. So it includes citizens, customers, elected officials, management, employees and their representatives, and other governments, as well as the media, and of course, civil society organizations. So why is it important for us to understand the role that civil society organizations play in our national budget and vice versa? So what are you interested in? According to the IBP study, CSOs are interested in budget allocation data, revenue, performance indicators, to even extra budgetary allocations. Now, my question to you is that if this is the information that is relevant to you, how many of you know how and where to find it? So we've made a case. In many countries, the calls have been made for open budgets. So what can we do here in Trinidad and Tobago to follow suit? First, let's start with where we are before we can identify what we need to do and how do we move on. We'll draw upon some of the results from the Open Budget Survey to take a look at our standing with regard to three very important components of good governance and of a good budget. These include transparency, budget oversight, and public participation. So what you're seeing in front of you here is the rankings for Trinidad and Tobago based on a 2019 Open Budget Survey. The overall ranking of Trinidad and Tobago was 90 out of 117 participating countries. The overall ranking is drawn from transparency indicators, budget oversight indicators, and public participation indicators. So let me give you guys a few seconds to take in what you're seeing in front of you and to discuss these results. For Trinidad and Tobago, our transparency index was 30 out of 100. It might be interesting to note that Trinidad and Tobago's transparency score is actually lower than that of Jamaica, who also participated in the 2019 OBI. Jamaica's score was 42 compared to Trinidad and Tobago's 30. In fact, from the time I've been involved with the Open Budget Survey, between 2010 and 2019, Trinidad and Tobago's transparency score has always ranged between 30 to 38. Let's take a look at public participation. In this case, Trinidad and Tobago scores the same as Jamaica. Now, we have some polls that we're hoping to launch. And one of the quick questions we'd ask participants is that whether you have ever been invited, whether you have ever been consulted with regard to the budget process. It will be interesting because when we look at public participation, it's very important for us to recognize that a score of 17 out of 100 leaves much to be desired. And this is what we're targeting to date. This is what we want to have our civil society understand and to become more involved in. Before we get to that deeper understanding of the budget, let's start with what your understanding is at this moment. I can ask, and we can all agree that the tendency is that for us to consider our budget as this single document associated with a grand presentation on a single day. So everybody looks forward for budget day, D-Day. And we tend to rely on that budget statement as the beginning and end of all we need to know and what we need to know about the budget. However, the budget statement is only a small part of the budget process, and it is important to understand the budget process and not just what we rely on as a budget statement. So the finding is that we have a lack of understanding between the connection of budget information and governance and development. So the Open Budget Index itself is a reflection of the timeliness, availability, transparency of key budget documents. Mind you, I said documents, not document. So we'll start talking about what those documents are. And this reflects the degree of transparency of the country for several reasons, for comparative reasons, as well as a reflection of our budget oversight in terms of the strength of institutions such as our Auditor General. Why is all of this important? Again, I'd like to make the connection between governance, development, and our budget. I always tell students, I say there's a difference between development and growth. There's a difference between what you have and what you can do. If we all have a car, that is a representation of what we have. It is an entitlement to a certain extent. But if we're not able to drive the car, of what benefit is that to us? So development is a connection between what we have and what we can do with what we have. And being able to make decisions in terms of what we can do, particularly as it relates to our national budget, includes elements of good governance such as accountability, transparency, participation, rule of law, equity, and freedom. So understanding the state of Trinidad and Tobago's budget, as reflected by the Open Budget Survey results, should be compelling enough to create the space for civil society to want to understand the budget more so as to demand more from the government. What is the national budget process? Where is the information? Are the targets met? Are some of the questions that civil society organizations should be asking, and therefore, with such information, putting into motion the need for more open budgets and better governance. As we stand, civil society participation for a variety of reasons in the national budget process is inadequate. And many of the reasons that contribute to the lack of participation is based on a lack of knowledge of the rights of the civil society organizations, of the responsibilities that we have as a general public in holding the government accountable, and also in terms of demanding the information that we are entitled to. So it's time for us to deepen engagement with the budget process. We need to hold our government accountable for providing better budget data. We need to take responsibility in ensuring that there is good governance and not sit by and wait for it to happen automatically. Civil society organizations also stand to benefit because they can leverage budget data in their work and make critical gains. But those who do not could be left behind. So let's get to that brief on what you need to know about your national budget. Now, for me, this took almost 10 years to become quite familiar with all the budget documents and the processes involved. In this webinar, we're hoping to introduce to you some of the main elements of our budget process. But in particular, we're also hoping to whet your appetite to learn more. So the first step is understanding the national budget documents and the budget process. Now note, I didn't say the budget document or the budget statement. We're looking at the budget as a continuous process, which involves a continuous set of reporting and provision of information and engagement of the public throughout the fiscal year, throughout the year. So a good budget process is characterized by several essential features. It must incorporate a long-term perspective, establish linkages to broaden organizational goals. It focuses on budget decisions, on results and outcomes. It involves and promotes effective communication with stakeholders, and it provides incentives to government management and employees. Now, in my discussions with the TTEITI earlier on this project, we spoke about several issues as it relates to the national budget process. One of which is the fact that you have a system where, we'll get to the timeline, ministries have to provide accounts, and they have to account for expenditures and allocations. And with any business, if you look at it from an organizational point of view, if you have unspent allocations, if you have unspent resources, at the end of your fiscal year, what's the objective? The objective is to spend it, because in further budgeting, if you are over allocated, it means that in the fiscal year that is upcoming, you will be under allocated. This tends to happen a lot within our ministries. So we need to have a better system of looking at budget decisions, results and outcomes, and in a sense, looking at the returns on investment on what is allocated to each ministry and what is allocated to each sector. It is also vital for the budget process to include all stakeholders. So this means involving stakeholders, identifying their issues and concerns, obtaining support for the overall budget process, achieving stakeholder acceptance of decisions related to goals, services, and resource utilization, and certainly with regard to accountability, reporting to stakeholders on services and resource utilization, and serve generally to enhance the stakeholders' view of the government. Where do we get the information that we're looking for? That takes us to our key budget documents. So many of us have our own individual objectives. We would look for specific information. Students, for example, will be concerned about expenditure on the education sector. What is happening to GATE? What schools are being built? It's the same for parents, of course. Civil society organizations will also have their sets of objectives. We need to understand, despite the variety of objectives, that we are all looking for transparency, accountability, and participation. So first of all, we're hoping that when we can consider the budget, we understand that there are a variety of documents that we can rely upon for information and for different levels of information as well. We have approximately 12 budget documents that tend to be presented and made available on the day of the budget itself. So apart from your budget statement, which is perhaps the most popular, you have a call circular. The call circular itself is distributed to ministries to ask for their submissions of what they anticipate will be their needs. They are guided in the call circular by particular government priorities and developmental objectives. So your call circular actually it comes before your budget statement. Apart from the budget statement, there are various types of draft estimates. For example, there is a draft estimate of revenue. There are also draft estimates of expenditures, recurrent and capital. If you are interested in data as it relates to the social sector, which I expect many CSOs will be interested in, we have a social sector investment program document as well. Apart from that, there are what we call the Public Sector Investment Program, or PSIP, and the State Enterprises Investment Program. As mentioned before, there are the various draft estimates and a review of the economy that gives a summary of the performance of the economy in the previous budget year. When does our national budget take place? If I ask many of you, you can tell me. You can say it's the end of September, beginning of October. However, our national budget is a continuous process. Our national budget is not limited to budget day. That morning of the Minister of Finance's presentation to when it ends does not represent our national budget. The process begins from February, where a call circular is sent out to ministries, and we spoke about the call circular document earlier, to where various submissions are made, appropriations are finalized, and then around October 1st, which marks the end of our fiscal year, there is a budget presentation. It does not end there, however. A budget process does not only include a budget presentation, but it also includes observations made by our oversight institutions. So the budget process continues, whereby it is necessary to have mid-year reviews, which we've recently started, and which is actually quite notable in terms of progress in opening our budget process. We also have our audits by our Auditor General and respective financial oversight institutions. What else might we be interested in? Apart from the budget document, some of the main sets of data that are relevant to civil society organizations includes revenues and expenditures. So where does the money come from? In terms of revenues, the majority of our revenues are based on non-oil revenue. However, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, there is still a very high dependence on oil revenue. In fact, as we will discuss later on, we tag our economic projections based on the prices of oil and gas. And these are global prices that we have very little to no control over. So a key note to understand where the money comes from is to observe what is happening on the global market for these commodities that we're dependent on as exports. We can look at subcategories of revenues, and this information once again is available in what we call the draft estimates of revenues. So if you're looking for this type of data, the document you're relying on is the draft estimates of revenue, and you would find multiple years reported in these documents. So for example, subcategories of tax revenue, such as income and profits, property, goods and services, and international trade are detailed. And then with regard to non-tax revenue, we're looking at property income and other types of revenues detailed for various years, for multiple years. Of course, with COVID-19, projections have changed significantly. In fact, whilst previous projections indicated that revenues would have had some negative impact because of global events, COVID-19 has exacerbated these negative impacts. What previously was thought to be small levels of economic growth or even small levels of declines in economic growth has been now exacerbated. In many of the Caribbean islands, Bahamas, Barbados, and Trinidad, Jamaica, we have seen IMF projections actually indicate a worsening in terms of economic growth. It's even so for Guyana, which was the only Caribbean country with positive economic growth, but with not as much as was anticipated before. COVID-19, as I mentioned earlier, has made the need for open budgets even more apparent because it represents a reallocation of already limited resources to areas that we definitely need and areas that we need accountability for to ensure that the resources are being spent and utilized efficiently. Once again, we notice our dependence on energy. These prices represent global prices for gas and for oil. And the observations here should show us that as we peg our national budget revenues, and therefore as we estimate our expenditures based on these global prices, we are subject to that sort of vulnerability and volatility of the global markets. So again, in understanding the budget, we have to be aware of how global events also impact upon us. Now to what many of us always anticipate in the budget. Where is the money being spent? Over the past few years, we've seen the majority of resources allocated to three main sectors: education and training, health, and national security. Now, these information provide an idea of sectoral allocation of resources. A proper budget, however, should be able to tell us about the return on investment. So, for example, if 6.1 billion is allocated to the health sector, what are the variables, what are the indicators that will tell me that this 6.1 billion was well spent? The same goes for education and training. What are the outcomes of 8.0 billion being spent on education and training? As a civil society organization, these are some of the questions you need to ask. You need to ask not only what is being spent or how much is being spent and where it comes from, but what are the outcomes? I've always made the point that for years, perhaps not now, in Trinidad and Tobago, money should have not been our problem. In fact, we were in a much better place when compared to many other economies, particularly in the Caribbean. However, the issues with regard to our economy were not based on how much money we have. And when I say money, I'm talking about resources in general. The issues that really came out from our economy were based on how what we had, the resources, were managed. So spending 8.0 billion on education and training does not necessarily indicate that we are all, or the society is going to be more educated if we are not able to see the outcomes associated with that expenditure. The same goes for health. Is spending 6.1 billion on health necessarily associated with a healthier population? So these are the questions, once again, that I challenge CSOs to begin asking. Of particular interest to CSOs, we also have our expenditures on social infrastructure and social programming. This here represents those programs and that expenditure that is targeted at issues related to the society. We talk about unemployment. We're talking about education. We're looking at health. We're looking at poverty. So once again, social expenditures tend to be very, very significant. And once again, as I made the point before, I challenge CSOs to ask, what is the output of these types of expenditures? So, what should you ask? We began with looking at the elements of a good budget process. We began looking at what transparency involves, what public participation involves, and what oversight involves, and how it basically forms a budget that is considered open. So, have public consultations informed the budget process? You also need to ask, is there sufficient time for gauging the public's feedback? When the budget statement is read, to the time it is enacted, so the budget statement represents a proposal, and then later on, once debated, there is the enacted budget. Is there sufficient time for gauging the public's feedback? How often does the budget statement as a proposal differ from the enacted budget? Does it ever change? Does the debate make a difference? Does the public's feedback make a difference? And that gets us to question 3. To what extent does the enacted budget vary from the executive budget proposal? Is there sufficient time to debate? Is there sufficient time to gauge civil society and public input? Another question, which relates to accountability, is, does the government publish a mid-year review about changes in economic outlook? Now, I did mention that the practice of recent years was the presentation of a mid-year review. But what I would also like to highlight is, while we do have many documents that accompanies and supports our budget, we also have to be cognizant of the type and quality of information published in these documents. Do civil society organizations have access is one question, but do they understand the information is another. So the call to action. The purpose of this webinar is to really introduce to you your role in the national budget process. It is to highlight to you the importance of becoming part of this process. Essentially, it means that we want that you can understand that there are benefits to be derived from greater engagement. We hope that it will encourage you to lobby the government to produce and make publicly available key budget documents, form better coalitions, mobilize around budget inputs, and get informed by studying and sharing this online guide and other budget resources. So I hope you've been intrigued by today's webinar, by the presentation. It certainly does not represent an entirety of what the issues are, but it certainly and hopefully encourages you to ask more questions, which is what we will encourage now as we end the webinar, the formal webinar. Slide. Let's go back.
All right. Good morning once again, and a warm welcome to all of our attendees. This is Kerry jumping in here as we get ready to take your questions and your comments. What I want to say is if you can use either the chat feature on Zoom. If you look at the bottom, I think, of your Zoom window, you should see a chat feature, or you should see a Q&A feature. If you want to send questions directly to us, you can send to the TTEITI Communications account, or post it in the open chat for all and sundry. But we really want your feedback. We want questions for Malini, and we're gonna jump right into Q&A now. So let me field your questions. If you want to say something, please raise your hand. There's a raise hand feature on Zoom as well that you can use. I will see you and unmute your microphone, and you can ask a question or make a comment. Thank you. All right. I see a question coming in from Zinga Job. Can you hold the government accountable as an employee? Very, very good question, Zinga. Thank you. So I will throw that to Malini. And if not, as well, Sherwin, please feel free to jump in here. But can you hold the government accountable as an employee? Employees are an important stakeholder, and therefore that's a very valid question.
Okay, hi Zinga. Good morning. Definitely. I think one of the things that we want to encourage is the fact that all citizens have to hold the government accountable. All citizens are stakeholders in the budget process. So whether you are an employee of the government or not, you are a citizen. And one of the things that we fail to recognize is that the resources are entrusted by us to the government for management. So they are essentially accountable to all citizens for the use of the resources of our country that belongs to the people of the country.
Okay, we have another question from Sharon Motley. Sharon is asking, in countries that do have active involvement and participation by civil society, do we see this involvement reflected in budgets? So in countries that the CSOs are actively participating in the process, is there evidence that this is leading to actual difference in how the budgets are formulated?
Certainly. Some of the countries that score high on the Open Budget Index are countries such as New Zealand, the Dominican Republic, because when we look at it from a Caribbean context as well, and within these types of economies and within these countries, civil society engagement is very high. In fact, what has also been found is that there is a correlation between civil society involvement and engagement, open budgets, and human development. Countries that score well in terms of the Open Budget Index and are seen to have more transparent, accountable, and participative budgeting actually also demonstrate higher levels of human development when we consider the Human Development Index, for example, when we look at basic human development factors such as access to knowledge, health, and along and basic living standards. So there are qualifications to say that more civil society engagement will not just lead to better budgets, but will also lead to higher levels of development.
Thank you, Malini. Okay, jump in. We want to get as many questions answered as possible. So we have a question from Diana Ramnath. Diana asks, regarding the accountability of CSOs and the government, Malini would have highlighted many questions we should ask. How do we measure this accountability and engagement? From the outside, you're CSO, or you're a professional, or you're simply a member of the interested public at large. How are we measuring this accountability and engagement? Is that something that takes time? What are CSOs to look for?
I think the first way of gauging accountability and engagement is to consider how many CSOs actually participate in the budget process. We tend to have some public consultation where invitations are sent to certain merchant associations. So you might have AmCham or TTMA saying and also being part of the budget process. But of course, it in no way is a representation of the cross-section of CSOs in Trinidad and Tobago. So we need to start first, I think, as a unified body of CSOs, looking at how many of us, how many CSOs are invited to these types of consultations. And not only that, what are the outcomes from these public consultations? So when there is the budget proposal, how many indications in the budget proposal come from CSO contributions? So it may be subjective in a sense because there is no one metric that we could rely on as a measure for accountability and engagement, but we can look at the process itself and look at how we can insert ourselves within the process and use that to determine whether or not there is greater or lesser participation.
Thank you, Malini. During your presentation, you touched on a number of slides when you were talking about the different budget documents. You made it clear to us that there wasn't a single budget statement. Everybody tends to focus on the budget statement, but you said that we should be looking at a spectrum of budget documents, plural. And so Danny has a question that I think is very pertinent to that part of the presentation. Danny asks, typically a budget can be defined as an estimate of revenues and expenditure for a period for the fiscal year. In what document does the government tell the population the actual revenues and the actual expenditures? So the statement, the budget statement is an estimate. Where can you find the actual figures?
Okay. So as the presentation indicated, there are draft estimates of revenues and expenditures. These are very large documents. They're very huge, they're heavy. One of the key elements of these documents is that presentations of data are made for the budgeted year, which will be the estimates. But in terms of actual information is also presented for the previous budget year. So there are various categories for the budget year, for the year before the budget, and even 2 years before the budget, for which actual values are compared to estimates. And there are also indications of the variances between them. So for example, in the budget or the fiscal year 2021, in the draft estimates of revenue and expenditure, the values that you will see for 2021 will be estimates for revenue and expenditure. However, for 2020, in the very same document, that is in the very same draft estimates, you would see estimated values and next to it in a column, actual values. So usually reporting in terms of the variance between what was estimated and what was realized are done for the previous budget years.
Excellent. There are a couple questions and comments, all addressing the issue of CSO engagement, right? How CSOs, how civil society organizations, and interested members of the public, how can they press for greater engagement? And somebody's actually asking about, are there laws on the books to compel the government to engage with CSOs? Is there any legal recourse, redress, right? So what mechanisms can CSOs use to press for greater engagement? And are there any legal provisions to compel the government to answer CSO questions?
Now, according to our constitution, there are no provisions that mandate the government to engage the public or even CSOs. So our constitution does not provide for that demand for public engagement. So it means that we have to be the ones to lobby to be part of the process. I would also like to make the general comment that, as we're talking about the Constitution once again, that we see the need for there to be reform in our Constitution. It's been happening, but it's been quite slow. So it calls for that bigger demand for constitutional reform. Apart from that, there are other provisions that mandate the government to provide information to the public, such as the Freedom of Information Act, which is a legal document, which is legally binding and for which civil society organizations and the public can hold government accountable for. So with regard to the provision of information, yes, there is that legal, there's that legal provision, but with regard to public engagement, no, the government is not mandated to by any way or within the Constitution to have to engage the public.
All right. And I suppose a related question I'm seeing now from someone is on the issue of legislation around budget transparency and accountability. Is there anything in Trinidad and Tobago's legal framework that stipulates or mandates transparency around the budget or accountability to the public CSOs in any sort of in any specific way related to the budget?
So there are different institutions within our parliament that have been established to look at budget oversight. So apart from the Office of the Auditor General, which is governed by a specific type of legislation, there are also parliamentary units, such as the Public Accounts Committee, you have the Financial Scrutiny Unit, etc., for which they are they are to hold government spending accountable and audited. There are, however, issues with regard to the process by which this takes place. Because, for example, in your Public Accounts Committee, the members of your Public Accounts Committee are the members of your legislature, and the majority of whom would be also nominated by your executive. So it's kind of like saying the police is policing themselves. So that's another issue there in terms of how are we ensuring that oversight is independent, and whether we have that sort of independence when the units and the legislation that supports those units and institutions are funded by and nominated by the legislature.
Very, very good response, Malini. I think this is a very valid question as well. Someone is asking if there's a process for getting clarity on budget documents. But what they specifically want to know is who do you ask? Who's who in this whole budget business in Trinidad? Is it just the Honorable Minister of Finance, or are there other technocrats or people that CSOs should know about inside of the budget process?
Well, this is where I think CSOs can also fill a gap. There is the Ministry of Finance, which is basically the repository of budget information. You will tend to rely on this ministry for any type of information as it relates to the budget. But apart from that, I think there is the need for CSOs, or a CSO in particular, to take the responsibility of compiling and actually scrutinizing the budget itself as an independent body. So we don't necessarily have one person or one independent institution that provides the data. You can use, as I said, the Freedom of Information Act to request information, but I think we have an opportunity here to develop some specialization in terms of civil society's involvement by having an organization or developing an organization with the commitment of specialists, whether they are involved in the ministry or outside of the ministry, to provide this sort of information to the public as well. So it's probably not there apart from the Ministry of Finance, but there's an opportunity to develop a repository of budget information provided by and scrutinized by a civil society organization.
Thank you, Malini. Okay, so at this point, I just want to pause the questions for a bit. I'm watching the time. We have a few minutes. I want to toss to Sherwin Long, head of the TTEITI Secretariat. Again, just to remind CSOs about the value of this kind of discussion and why we're here. And following that, I will ask all attendees at this morning's session to participate in a few polls that we have set up inside of Zoom. So I am going to, while Sherwin is making a few comments, I will set up the polls, and right after that, I will ask you guys to give us some feedback. Right, the polls are ready to generate to get your feedback, so that we can continue to improve the other webinars in this series. Sherwin?
Okay, thanks again, Kerry. Again, I'm really heartened by the discussion. Again, this project really is to strengthen fiscal management and accountability by building CSO capacity. So some of the things that we want to see, they're actually coming out from the questions. We need to build capacity to actually look at the data, to see where the money is being spent. I think Malini did an excellent job laying the groundwork for that. But it's also to empower CSOs to use this information to hold government account. This is the first leg in our journey. There will be several different webinars as part of this series, linking you to the decision makers as well, acting as a sort of a bridge to facilitate that sustained government CSO consultation and collaboration on national budgetary allocations. So again, this is the first leg, and I'm really heartened to see the interest and to hear some of the feedback coming back from the participants and from the attendees. Because when you look at benchmarking yourself as a country, you say to yourself, listen, where can we do better compared to other countries? What have they done that we can improve on to help our process? And that's what we're looking at. We're going to take a dive into issues related to participatory budgeting, getting more civil society engagement with the movers and shakers in the halls of power. So I'm very heartened by the discussion so far. And Kerry, I toss back to you. We have some polls up for you, for the attendees and those listening to fill out for us. This is a conversation, and we want your feedback as well. We don't just want to be talking to you. Back to you, Kerry.
Okay, thank you, Sherwin. So I have just actually, I think Malini wants to make a comment about the polls, but the first poll is active. So I will have Malini just explain to us what this poll is trying to gauge, and we will go to the other poll right after that.
Hi, good morning again. So the polls that you are engaging in right now are basically an assessment of how you have been participating and whether you've been participating in the budget process. We really also want to gauge your feedback in terms of your thoughts about the transparency of our budget process in Trinidad and Tobago. Apart from the open budget indicators, we want to know what you believe to be happening on the ground. What are your priorities and what are your concerns? Because while it's all good for us to utilize an international index, we ourselves are the ones who have to take responsibility for it, and we are the ones who know what is happening here. So when you answer these questions to the polls, it's giving us an indication of whether there is validity in calling for open budgets and whether we can see the momentum and some possibility of change with regard to demanding more from the government with regard to our national budget process and ensuring that civil society organizations become more involved in this process. So we're looking forward to this feedback to help us develop the way forward. We're also looking for feedback from you in terms of how you think we should more engage our civil society organizations so that we can ensure that we assist in facilitating this process of participation. So I'll go back to Carrie now, who would give us some other feedback on the polls.
Okay, just to say that we are about to end the first poll, so we're asking everyone if you can take a minute. If you can't see the poll, please let us know. But yes, I'm going to end the first poll in maybe less than a minute, a few seconds. So if you can complete that poll and get ready to, for us to launch the second one. Okay, quick house announcement that we have just launched the second poll, and Malini will just offer some guidance on this particular poll. Malini?
Thank you, Carrie. So based on the issues raised with regard to transparency here now, this poll is assessing whether you think the budget process itself is transparent. Now, just to highlight the reason why we've had such a poor performance in the budget process transparency indicator is because it's not just about having information available, but making it available to the public So in many instances, we find that there are documents that support the budget process being being produced but not being published. For example, is there a pre-budget statement? Is there anything that is available to the public prior to budget day that will give the public an idea of what the budget priorities will be? In many instances, I've been told that a pre-budget statement exists, but not for public participation, and it's not published to the public as well. What we have presented is a mid-year review, and as a review of the economy also represents budget documents that provide some information. However, details in terms of specific outcomes that are to be part of a mid-year review are also not made public. So there are documents that I understand are produced, but many of the vital information are not made public. So this question asks not just about what you are presented with in the form of budget documents, but whether the information that you're looking for in these budget documents are available.
Thank you, Malini. I am just now going to give a couple minutes again on this particular poll, after which let me just look at the questions here. Right, after which I toss back to Sherwin to do a quick vote of thanks. Let me say it's been a pleasure moderating this event, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all at our next in this series on the budget. We will be sharing these slides, the entire presentation deck via email. So stay plugged into tteiti.com. And these resources are also going to be made available on TTEITI's website. Additionally, the TTEITI has developed an online guide. It's a digital guide. It's optimized for your mobile phones, and it's a really comprehensive guide to the national budget, including information presented in this webinar. So you're going to have even more extensive material to look at in terms of the budget, in terms of the budget documents, where you can find stuff, where to look for your own interests based on the work that you do as a CSO. And we will share that online guide with participants in the coming, by tomorrow. We will publish that, go live with that, and it will be shared via email and made available via TTEITI's website. So stay tuned, keep checking in on the website, and stay plugged into our email list for more updates. Let me hand over to Sherwin for a quick vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kerry. The easy job now of saying thanks. Firstly, I'd like to thank our partners on this project, Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, as well as the U.S. Embassy for their sponsorship. A heartfelt thanks to Ms. Maharaj for her insightful presentation. She really gave us a succinct overview. I'd like to thank all of the attendees, the CSOs. As Kerry said, please stay tuned. We'll be sending you a lot of information, and this is the first of many seminars of the kind. Thank you again for attending. I'd like to thank the TTEITI Secretariat team and Kerry as well for helping us pull this off. And we definitely look forward to engaging with you in the future. I'd like to ask all of you to please be safe. We're in the time of COVID, and safe journey if you're going to work, or if you're already home, be safe. Anyway, thanks again, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Take care.
Okay, thank you, everybody.